Hello everybody and welcome to Principles of Game Design. In this video we're going to be running through the Maya interface, as well as some of the tools we'll be using in this semester. So to start with, we're going to go up to File, and we're going to be setting the project which we'll be using for the rest of the semester. So I'm going to click Set Project down here near the bottom, and you'll notice that by default it's trying to put me in our computer's C drive. That's not a good thing if you are on any of the Digital Media Center computers, since every time we log out of those computers our files get deleted. So instead we're going to go to My Computer, and you can choose to either make a file in the D drive or in a personal external hard drive. I'm going to choose my personal hard drive, and in here I'm going to create a new folder, right-click New Folder, and name it Principles of Game Design. Inside of that folder, I'm going to make another new folder, and I'm going to name this one Maya. And once I'm in the Maya folder, I'm going to click this Set button. And it's going to pop up asking me if I want to create a default workspace. I'm going to tell it yes. And now if we pop open to File Explorer, we have our 3 computer drives. Inside of my external hard drive, I have my Principles of Game Design folder, my Maya folder, and that default workspace we just made. Let's come back to Maya. And let's do one more step. Go up to File, and down above Set Project we have Project Window. Click that, and you'll be presented a list of folders. Don't worry about them, just hit Accept. And if you go back to File Explorer, you now have a list of folders. The ones we'll be caring most about in this class are Autosaves, for obvious reasons, Images, where we'll be saving our renders, Scenes, where we'll be saving most of the work we're doing, and Source Images, where we'll be putting our references. Alright, so if we go back to the File menu, we have 3 different versions of Save. We have Save Scene, which is basic, Control-S, Save Scene As, also basic, Control-Shift-As if you want to rename a file, and Increment and Save, which is the special kind of saving that we want to use most often. So for instance, I'm going to go ahead and Control-S, save this file. It's going to be put straight into my Scenes file because we set our project. I'm going to go ahead and name this file. There we go. And now let's try and test that Increment and Save, that Control-Alt-S. I'm going to change something about my scene, and if we pay close attention to the file name up in the top left corner, I'm going to click this cube button, for instance. And now our file name in the top left corner has an asterisk, which means we haven't saved recently. So I'm going to hit Control-Alt-S, and now my file has a little number attached to it. Let's go ahead and change something else about our scene. I'm going to hit this cylinder button, get that asterisk back, Control-Alt-S, and that number has gone up. What that is doing, if we pop one last time into our File Explorer, if we go into our Scenes folder where we're saving our files, we now have that first file we made and our 2 Increments and Save. These are iterative saves, so if we accidentally mess up, we can go back to an earlier version without having to hit undo 1,000 times. Now that we've learned about saving, let's go ahead and talk about autosaves. So, go up to the Windows menu, which is right here, and go down to Settings and Preferences about halfway down the menu. We're going to go to the Preferences menu, click that, and we're going to be presented with this window. Down here in the Settings section, we're looking for Files/Projects, and by default our autosaves are turned off. I highly suggest that you click the Enable button and change how often you'd like for Maya to autosave. And all of those files will be automatically put into your project's autosave destination, or you can change the name of where you want your autosaves. Alright, now let's talk about Maya's interface. So first off, this large window is our viewport. This is where we will be doing 90% of our work, and it's where we can interact with a 3D space. So earlier I made this cube and cylinder. Let's zoom in so that we can get a good perspective. So, to navigate the 3D space, you simply need to click in the middle of nowhere, hold Alt to rotate around an object, hold Alt and right-click to pan in and out, and hold Alt and middle-click to pan side to side. You can also use the mouse wheel to zoom. One more time, Alt left click, spin, Alt right click, zoom, Alt middle click, pan. Alright, now let's talk about the things in the corners of our viewport. In the top right, we have our view cube. This cube tells us which way our camera is facing, and if we click on any of the sides or faces or edges of the cube, it'll rotate our perspective camera to that side. This is particularly helpful if we don't know which way our camera is facing, and we want to get a particular shot. On the other hand, in our bottom left corner, we have this XYZ axis. Now some of you might be recognizing this grid as a Cartesian coordinate system. However, you should note that this grid is actually the XZ axis, which means that our Y coordinate points straight up, away from the grid. If you want to be able to see the XY grid, the easiest way of doing so is by hitting the spacebar. The spacebar divides our viewport into 2 or 4 panels. So now I have this one which says perspective, which is the spinny 3D version, and our orthographic views, which we cannot rotate by holding Alt. You'll notice that if I Alt and click, it says they are locked. But we have our top view, our front view, and our side view, and they all have different axes. Alright, I'm going to hit spacebar one more time, and that'll bring me back to my perspective view. Hitting spacebar will always bring you back to your most recently clicked viewport. If you don't like hitting the spacebar, you also have these buttons on the left. The big one is the main view, the 4 is the 4 split, and the 2 is the 2 split. The other button underneath there is an outliner, which shows us all of the things in our current level. So for instance, you remember me hitting the cube and cylinder button before. They are right here. I can click the cube and the cylinder, and they are all in there. So that we can see our cube, I'm going to go ahead and move this cylinder out of the way. And the way I'm going to do that is by selecting the cylinder in either the outliner or the level, and hitting the W key. And you'll notice that that changes my arrow selection on the left to the Move tool. So now I can grab any of these arrows and move my cylinder, and there's my cube. Now I'm going to go ahead and hide my outliner because we don't really need it, and let's talk about the different ways we can move our models. So first off, we just showed the Move tool. We have the E key, which is the Rotate tool, which allows us to rotate objects in 3D space. And we have the Scale tool, which is under the R key, that allows us to scale our objects in different directions. We also have our Basic Selection tool, that is under the Q key. Q, W, E, and R are our basic movement tools. Now that we've talked about all of those tools, let's look over here on the right to our channel box, which contains all of that information in a numerical fashion. So for instance, I haven't moved this cube, but if I move it up, we'll see that the translate Y changes, side to side changes X, and back and forth changes Z. Same thing if I were to rotate the object, then we can see that our rotates change, and as we scale the object, our scales change. If we want to make this box a particular size, shape, and orientation, we simply need to type in the numbers. So let's say that I want this cube to be 3, 3, 3, so that it stays square, and let's change our rotates so that it's rotated 45 degrees Y. And now it is pointing in the direction of our axes. We can also then move it up and down with our translate tools. So let's say that I want it up Y 5. And there we go. Now it's up and to the side, and our cylinder is pointing at it. Neat. In addition to the channel box inputs, we also have these inputs, which are particular for every object. So for our cube, if I click this Polycube 1 input, we are given the options to change our width, height, and depth, as well as our subdivisions for the object. So I can go ahead and type, say, 2 in each of these, and this is the same as if we had another cube. Let's make another cube real quick. and change our scale up to 6. These two cubes are now exactly the same size, because this cube has a height, width, and depth of 2 and a scale of 3, and this one has a height, width, and scale of 1 and a scale of 6. 3 times 2 is 6. The math checks out. We also have the ability to increase our subdivisions, so if I wanted to add in some more detail on my cube, I could go and add some subdivisions, and now I have a couple more faces to play with. Speaking of, let's talk about how we select the individual pieces of our objects. The easiest way of doing so is by going down to the bottom right one of these menus on the far right side, which is our modeling toolkit. In here at the top, we have our object select, vertex select, edge select, and face select. Vertices are the little points that make up our model, and we can move and interact with them with our move, rotation, and scale tools. To select multiple, all you have to do is hold Shift and click the ones you want, or drag a selection box around them, and you can hold Control to deselect. Once you have your selections, you can scale them out with the Scale tool, rotate them with the Rotate tool, and move them with the Movement tool. In addition to our vertices, we can also control edges. So if I go to Edge Select, this allows us to control particular edges. So I can select a bunch of them and move them the same way. Or you can double-click an edge, and it'll select the entire loop. If you don't want to select an entire edge loop and instead you want parallel edges, you can simply select one edge and then double-click its neighbor. And that'll give you all of the edge loops that are parallel to each other along the model. So one more time, double-click an edge gives you the edge that it is pointing along. Click one edge and double-click its neighbor gives you a loop going the other way around. Same thing with faces. If I go to Face Select, then I can select individual faces, and I can double-click a face to select the whole model, or click a face and double-click its neighbor to select a loop. Now you've also seen me occasionally holding right-click, and what this does is it pulls up a context menu. Since I'm currently in Face Select mode, by holding right-click, I can quickly swap to Edge, Vertex, and Face modes just by holding right-click and dragging my mouse over any of these options. If I want a different context menu, I can hold Shift and right-click, and that'll give me a bunch of tools. Now you'll notice, for instance, that this bottom tool says Extrude Face. That is the same as, if we look over here on our far right in our modeling toolkit, this Extrude Components section that is down halfway. So if you are used to using keyboard shortcuts, you can hold Shift and right-click, and depending on your selection, you can access tools that are very similar to the ones in the modeling toolkit. You can also, if you want to keep the channel box open, use tools from the modeling toolkit up here in the Poly Modeling shelf. So for instance, that same Extrude button, we have this Extrude button, notice the picture next to it, it is the same as this picture up here, that is our Extrude. It is also the same as this picture, and that is how you can tell which one is which. Up here in our Poly Modeling shelf, now that we're talking about it, let's run through some simple examples of the tools up here. First, on the far left, is our Poly Primitives. These are simple shapes which we'll be using to start all of our models. Let's go ahead and select all of these and delete them real quick and run through them. We have a sphere, we have a cube, we have a cylinder, we have a cone, and we have the donut, or the torus. And lastly, we have two different types of planes, which are a square plane or a circular plane. Alright, now let's talk about the Sweep Mesh tool, which is this little squiggly thing. Gonna go ahead and click that. And that's going to automatically open the attribute editor, which is in between our channel box and modeling toolkit. The attribute editor lets us control specific things about the Sweep Mesh. So for instance, I have this tube. I can, let's go back to that Sweep Mesh Creator tab, and I can change the number of sides my tube has, or I can change how big it is, or I can give it a little twist. And this is a tool you can use to create ropes or cables, things of that nature. In addition, inside of this tube, we also have a hard-to-see NURBS curve, which we'll get to in a bit. And what this curve allows us to do, if we go ahead and select our vertices, we can select a vertex and move it and change the way that our cable moves. Alright, let's go ahead and delete that. Now let's talk about some of the component tools that I was talking about earlier. I'm going to go ahead and create a cylinder. Here we go. So, first off, let's talk about Extrude. If I select a face, then we can use the Extrude tool, and that'll change the way my arrows are facing away from that face, and I can pull it out. Same thing if I select multiple faces. Let's go ahead and select these two. I can hit that Extrude tool, and I can pull them out. I can also, with the Extrude tool, let's select a couple more faces, 1, 2, 3, hit that Extrude tool, and use this little menu to change how I'm extruding. So, for instance, let's add an offset this time, and you can see that I'm making smaller faces on top of the larger faces. With these new faces selected, I can also use the Extrude tool, and I can change my translate Z to a negative number, or use the little blue arrow to push them into the model. Now that we've talked about our extrusion tool, let's also talk about the bridge tool right next to it, which allows us to patch up holes. So if, for instance, you have a face and you delete it, you can go ahead and use the edge selection, double-click one of the edges around that hole, and click the bridge tool, and it'll patch it right up. Another use of the bridge tool is if we have two edges that we want to bridge together. So let's go ahead and delete these three faces. And let's say that we want to close this off as a single piece. I can click these two edges, bridge them together, and then I can bridge this hole by double-clicking an edge and bridging, and double-clicking an edge and bridging. And that allows me to create some interesting shapes. You can also use the bridge tool to correct multiple faces. So if I, let's say, delete these three faces next to each other, and I just want to close that hole, I can again double-click an edge, select the whole hole, and hit the bridge tool. However, if you do something like this face is now an n-gon. If we look at the other faces on our cylinder, we see that some of them are triangles, and some of them are four-sided polygons or quads. However, this face down here has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 sides. This is what we call an n-gon. 8 sides would normally be called an octagon, but an n-gon is simply any polygon with more than 4 sides. And they are bad. And to understand why they're bad, I'm going to go ahead and undo that bridge that I made earlier. And let's go ahead and duplicate a copy of this object. I'm going to Control D, that's duplicate. You'll notice that my lines change slightly. And if I use my movement tool, I can pull my copy out of the original. Alright, now let's go back to the original and redo that bridge we made earlier. Let's delete these faces and bridge that hole closed. Alright, so I have a version with my n-gon and a version without it. Now to understand why n-gons are bad, I'm going to hit the 3 key. And what the 3 key will do is it'll smooth our model. To get a good idea of what that means, I'm going to create a cube. Let's zoom in on this cube real quick. When I hit the 3 key, the cube will turn into a sphere. If I hit the 1 key, the cube will return back to a regular cube. The more edges my cube has, the less spherical it'll be. So let's go ahead and add a couple edges. And now when I hit the 3 key, it becomes less of a sphere, but it still becomes smooth. That's why we call the 3 view the smooth preview. So now let's go back to our weird shape, select both of them, and hit the 3 key. Now we'll notice an interesting effect. On the cylinder with the extra edge loops, everything seems to be fine and all of our curves are smooth. However, on our other cylinder, we have this pinching effect happening, and we can see that the model appears like it's tearing. So in order to fix an n-gon, if you accidentally create one, there are 2 ways. The first is to simply delete it, and go edge by edge, and bridge your hole closed that way. And that will prevent the creation of an n-gon. The other way is, if you go back to having an n-gon, you can use the Multicut tool, which is this knife with a bunch of little dots on it. What the Multicut tool allows us to do is several things. First, if you are on a model, you can click and drag on any of these edges and create a point. If you click and drag on any of these edges and pull it to a point, it'll turn yellow, and when you let go, you will be on that point. You can then click and drag on any other edge on that same polygon and create an edge by hitting the Enter key. You can also go ahead and cancel by hitting the Escape key. So with the Multicut tool's functionality, we can click and drag and create the edges that we want to break up our n-gon. Now that we've fixed up our n-gon, let's go ahead and talk about other uses of the Multicut tool. So one more time, you can always click and drag on an edge and let go and hit Enter to create an edge. You can also freely click throughout your model and create edges that way by hitting Enter. If you ever create an edge that would create a n-gon, so for instance this would create a triangle and a pentagon, you can cancel it by hitting the Escape key. You can also hold Control, and that'll give you the edge loop mode, where you can click and on any edge, create an edge loop around the whole model. If you hold Shift, then you will get this black dot, which perfectly subdivides a edge in 2. If you hold Shift and hold left click, then you can decide how much you want to split up an edge loop. So let's say I want it at 20%, I can go ahead and do that. If I'd like to do that a little bit faster, I can hold Control and Shift, and I will create edge loops that perfectly snap to certain percentages. Lastly, with the Multicut tool, if I go into an orthographic view, let's go to my side view or my front view, and let's focus in on our cube. I can click over here in the middle of nowhere, and I get this orange line. And what this orange line allows me to do is to cut new edges through my object. Don't have my object selected for some reason. Let's try that one more time. Click and drag, and I can add extra edge loops. There we go. And if I go back to my split view, let's get a good look at it in perspective. You can see those cuts go all the way through my cube. If I'd like those cuts to be a little straighter, let's go ahead and undo. I can hold Shift, and this will snap that orange line into particular angles, 15 degrees. And I can use this to create perfectly straight cuts through my model. You can also do this in perspective view, but you should be very careful about doing so, since even if you hold Shift, your line will be straight, but because of the perspective, your multicut might be crooked. Alright, let's go ahead and delete all of these. And let's talk about some of the other shelves we'll be using. First off is the Curves tab, which allows us to draw paths. So for instance, I can use this pencil tool to draw a little curve, and we can go back to our poly modeling section, click that sweep mesh tool, and create a rope that follows that curve. We also have the Sculpting tab, which allows us to sculpt on mesh as if it were clay. So let's go back to our poly modeling tab, create a sphere. Let's go ahead and make it a little bigger. Go back to our Sculpting tab, click the Sculpt tool on the far left, and this will allow us to sculpt on mesh like clay. You'll notice that I have this little brush that I can use to move the vertices around. I can increase the size of my brush by holding the B key and using my left mouse key, and that allows me to build up some shapes. If I want this to be a little bit softer, I can double click my sculpt brush over here on the left, and that'll pop up my tool settings. And I can lower some of these values, so let's see my strength, let's change that to 6, and my buildup, let's change that to 10, and now when I sculpt, I get soft bumps, hopefully. Let's crank my strength back up to 15. Really? There we go. You can see that I'm just slowly building up that mesh. And I can paint bumps on my geometry. Alright, let's go ahead and delete this object. Now let's go ahead and create a new cube and make it a little larger. And we're going to talk about some of the tools that are in the menus up top, which we haven't really touched about. So first off, in the Edit Mesh menu, we can find our Bridge and Extrude tools and some of the other tools over here on the Poly Modeling shelf. Over here in the Mesh tools, we have options to combine objects, as well as objects to mirror them. So for instance, if I have this one, let's go ahead and move it over here. Let's say I want to mirror it across my axes. I can go to Mesh and Mirror, and I have this little glitch. And the reason is because I'm attempting to move it in the X negative direction, which means I'm attempting to mirror it that way because of the arrow which I am pointing. If I change this direction to positive, then I am mirroring it across the X-axis correctly. I can then go back to Mesh and Mirror it, and this time I want to mirror it this way, so in change of the X-axis, I'm going to mirror it across the Z-axis. But I'm still mirroring in the negative direction, so let's change that to positive, and now I have 4 identical pillars. Now if we want to pull apart and combine these again, we can use the Combine and Separate tools, so I click Separate, and now they are individual objects. And then let's say that I want to only have some of them combined, I can click Mesh, Combine on some of them, and now I have these 2 pillars that are together, and these 2 which are separate. Let's go ahead and go back down to 1 pillar, and let's go ahead and move him back to the X-axis. The way I did that is by holding the X key, which is my Grid Snap tool, which allows me to snap the object's movement to particular points on the grid. Now inside the Mesh Tools tab are some of our more detailed tools to edit our object, in particular the Multicut tool, which is about halfway down. I'm going to be using the Insert Edge Loop tool here, so I'm going to go ahead and click that. And what this lets me do is click and drag on edges as it shows here, and I can quickly add in edge loops the same way I can by holding Control with the Multicut tool. I can also go ahead and double click the Insert Edge Loop tool, which is over here on the left, to pull up my tool settings, same as we did with the Sculpt tool, and change my settings to multiple edge loops, which allows me to add in as many edge loops as I want. So for instance, right now it's set to 2. I can make this, let's say, 10, and with 1 click, I can quickly add multiple edge loops. Let's go ahead and undo that for now, and move on to some other tools we'll be using. If we go up to our Deform menu, these are tools which we can use to warp our mesh. The ones we'll be using in this semester are the non-linear deformers. So for instance, let's click Bend, and inside of my object there is now an invisible curve. What we're going to do is we're going to hit the 4 key, which is going to give us a wireframe view. And inside of that object you can now see this straight white line. If we want to hide it again, go back to our shaded view, we can simply hit the 5 key, and now we're seeing the object. 4 for wireframe, 5 for shaded. Let's go back to 4 for now, and we've got our little noodle in the middle of our object. And over here in our channel box, where we change numbers to move our objects around, we have new inputs in this Bend 1 section. So I'm going to change this curvature up to, let's say, 45, and you can see that that has now warped my object. It is now bent. Let's go back to 4View, and we can see that the curve has bent in accordance with the curvature. We can crank this up as high as we'd like, and the object will follow along, very similar to our Sweep Mesh tool. Let's go ahead and undo that. One final thing I'd like to talk about is setting up Maya for rendering. So, if you look at our top left, underneath our file, we have this Modeling tab. If we click that, we can change to a rigging, animation, VFX, or rendering settings. And what these will do is they'll change the menus slightly up top depending on what you are going to do. For our purposes, I'm going to go ahead and pick rendering. Inside of the rendering tab, I really only care about two menus, the rendering and Arnold menus. The render menu controls all of the buttons that allow us to actually render, but in particular I'm going to change my render settings. By default, we are currently set to use EXRs. That's perfectly fine, but you can also change them to JPEGs or PNGs. I'm going to set mine to PNGs. And if we scroll further down, you can also change the resolution of your image. By default, it's set to 960 by 540, which is a little small. I like to change mine to 1920 by 1080, and sometimes I'll also change my resolution up to 300. This is fairly standard for our purposes so that we can get good quality images. Once you've changed your render settings, you can go over here to Arnold, and you can click the render button. And you'll get this pretty black square. And the reason you'll get a pretty black square is because we don't have any lights in our scene. So I'm going to go back to the Arnold menu, I'm going to go down to lights, and I'm going to add in a simple sky dome light. And now you can see that my camera is centered on this little pillar, and if I zoom out, I can capture the whole viewport, and I can move around, and the image in my render will update. If I don't want it to update, I can hit this red square, which will stop the renderer, change my camera around, maybe I want to zoom in, get a more dynamic angle, hit play again, and it'll render that screen. And I can once again rotate around, move around, and it'll automatically render. Now you can go to File, Save Image, and by default it'll save it to your Set Projects Images folder, and we can find those images later. That's going to do it for now. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next video.